Serious German Reddit, what do your grandparents tell you about the Nazi period? My grandparents lived in Germany 20 years after WW2. My grandmother has this story about going to get her hair dyed. She got it dyed blonde, and it was so well done that she just had to compliment the lady who did her hair. So she gushed out all her "this is so perfect, and I've never had a blonde this natural, and how did you do it so well?" The lady replied back, "Well, we had to learn." My grandma told me about the bombings mainly. How scared she always was. One time when the siren sounded, a friend of hers ran to the freight train station to try and save the horses there. Of course the station was the main reason they were being bombed in the first place. She ran down there after the bombing and they were just hauling her friend onto a cart. She was missing both legs and my grandma never saw her again. One of my grandfathers used to go fishing with grenades and the other was very lucky. He was 15 when the war ended, so only a few months too young to be drafted in the end. My mother also had several uncles who never came back from Russia. None of them really talked about the Nazi regime. They were all far too young to really know what was going on. My 15-year-old grandpa was the oldest, and he would have been 3 when Hitler took over. My grandmother, the one with the friend above, only ever said how terrible everything was, and she was definitely not a fan of Hitler's. There were a few stories. My grandmother told me about the bombs and the shelters. How her brother always brought his globe because he treasured it more than anything. How her birthday cake was full of glass shards after a bomb went down in her street. Her husband never said much about it. All I know is that one day he came home from school and his house was gone. Just gone. On the other side of my family, my grandfather told us about the Hitlerjugend, the Nazis' youth organization. He was just too young to man one of the flak cannons defending Stuttgart at the time. But I do know that cracking open phosphor bombs was great fun for the kids. When the city was surrounded, he and his friends decided to break out and fall into the back of the US Army. They were about 16 years old, had rifles and bicycles. If some old guy hadn't talked them out of it, I wouldn't be typing this up today. Not my grandparents, but a friend's grandma lived in East Germany during the war. Everything was okay for the most part. Everyone was working. Hitler had made the economy better and everything seemed to be okay. She was unaware of what was really happening to Jewish people. The Russians came, they arrived in her village, slaughtered the livestock to feed themselves, raped her and her sisters as well as their mom. One sister died. They beat all of them repeatedly, so they couldn't fight back. The worst was when 5 were on her, and they took turns between her sisters and mom. She was 13, her sister, that died, was 11, her older sister was 15 and her mom was 37. In German schools we learn a lot about the Nazi period, the war, and the Holocaust. All these facts from back then, combined with the declining, but still prevailing, shame ingrained into the German culture surrounding our flag and our nation make it very clear what a horrible time this must have been. However, to me the story that always captured the whole craziness of the war most clearly was how my grandfather's family lost all their land and became refugees. My grandfather was born in 1935 in a village in Poland, where his family owned quite a bit of land. My great-grandfather was a farmer. At the time, this village was not too far from the German border, so although this was Polish territory, a proportion of people living there were basically Germans. This seems weird in today's times, but you have to understand that borders in Europe shifted all the freaking time back in the days, and Germany had not been a unified country for very long at the time. Thus, this was kind of normal, and my grandfather's family was one of these German families living in Poland. As far as I understand my grandfather, this was never too much of an issue before the war, and people cared more about local issues than nationalities. You would speak Polish in school and with some of your friends, whereas you would speak German with other friends and your parents. That was it. When the Nazis invaded Poland, all that changed. Naturally, the Nazis simply arrested all local men at their arrival, including my great-grandfather. His brother, however, happened to be an officer in the German army, and by sheer coincidence happened to recognize my great-grandfather in the crowd of prisoners. He told soldiers to let my great-grandfather free, claiming that he's a German, and must therefore not be held prisoner. The higher-up Nazi officials accepted that, but also told my great-grandfather that, because he owned some land, and was a local German, He was now appointed the official Nazi representative of this village. I'm not sure if this is clear from the story, but this was an offer you cannot refuse type of situation. As the war went on, my grandfather's family had no option but to stay in their village and try to survive. At one crucial point towards the end of the war, however, the Nazis lost more and more ground, and the Russians came from the east. As the Russians made their way through Poland to get to Germany, they did to all Germans they found what the Nazis did to all Polish they found when they got there, took them prisoner, or just killed them. Recall that my great-grandfather had the unwanted honor of being the official Nazi representative of his village, so his family was in deep trouble. My great-grandmother immediately fled with their 3 small children to the only place they could go, Germany. My great-grandfather, on the other hand, had to stay until the very moment the Nazis lost his village to the Russians, after which it was too late to flee. So when the Russians came, he hid in the forest for months, occasionally sneaking into his house to get food and water. When the air was finally clear, he too fled to Germany, where he somehow managed to find my great-grandmother and the rest of the family. They ended up in a refugee camp, where they would live for the next 4 years, sometimes having barely enough to eat. Needless to say, they lost everything they owned before the war as their land became part of the Soviet Union. I have to remark that despite this tough childhood, my grandfather became an extremely friendly, humble person who never took anything for granted. Every German knows the look of a grandparent who grew up during the war, when you say you're finished, but your plate is still full. Miss you, Opa. RIP. TL. Doctor. During the war, my grandfather's family were in the unfortunate position to be Germans living right between Germany and Russia. The only thing they have ever told me was about the cruelties that both German and Russian soldiers committed. Above all, particularly my great-grandfather told me how people felt ashamed for Germany due to changes in the country. Many people never supported the Nazis in the area of Germany, where my family comes from. They were mainly forced to follow without any chance to express one's opinion. Talking about the war was a taboo subject to talk about with my grandfather. It was always never talk about the war, even though it was long finished. I know that it was mostly due to trauma, which is why he didn't want to talk. I found out after he died that he was once shot at and only just survived the air raids. Also in the last year of the war, his older brother joined the army, but just before they were gonna send him off, the man in charge of him said, "Go home, son, we are about to lose the war." That person in the end was kind for doing that. Depending on the time this happened, the guy in charge could have gotten in real trouble just for saying that. As far as I know, even just taking into consideration that Germany could lose the war meant treason. I wish I knew more details on the matter, but unfortunately everyone involved is dead, so I have no one to ask. But he probably knew that Germany was about to surrender. Knew my grandpa only briefly. He already was pretty senile when I was still very young and died soon after he went into retirement home. He was in the Kriegsmarine and apparently saw some horrific things in the east, like rotting corpses getting crushed by tanks and the unbearable smell. My grandma got fairly old. She mentioned seeing some Americans with their leg blown off. But once they were liberated, she said something about drinking warm fresh brewed beer at young age with them and the word chores in. My other grandparents sat it pretty much out in a more rural area, being somewhat safe from air raids. We live 50 kilometers away from Nuremberg. My great uncle actually migrated to America at like age 18 without any money before the war, served in the Navy, and got to study engineering through that. Later worked on satellites and did some testing on the lunar module for the NASA. I only have one grandma and I've never talked to her about it. I know her husband, who died before I was born, was a prisoner of war in Russia, but I don't really know too much about what her life was like. I like to think she wasn't a full-on Nazi, but I'm also aware that just because I know her as a wonderful and kind old lady doesn't mean she's an overall saint. You can kind of see the remnants of the Holocaust when walking through any random city in Germany, but only if you know what to look for. I don't know the English term for it, but in the time after the NS regime fell, most Germans had no idea how to deal with their history and people just pretended it never happened. At the corner of the street, where I now take dance classes, is a plaque saying there used to be a concentration camp there. Thousands of people died and suffered in that spot, and the only thing telling it apart from any other suburban street is a plaque. There are also the stolperstein or stumbling stones. They are little golden bricks that you can randomly see in the sidewalk sometimes. They are engraved with the name and information of Holocaust victims and are put into the sidewalk in front of their last chosen residence. I think Germans as a whole are very ashamed of what our country did. But we have eventually also made the active decision to do right by the people who were wronged by the NS regime. The only way to prevent something like this from happening again is to remember and learn. Students crying in history class sucks, but forgetting and repeating history is not worth the risk. I think America in particular should maybe adapt this mindset a little. It's kind of hard to be proud of your heritage if your heritage is genocide. That's why you'll never see people wearing black, red and gold outside the soccer World Cup. I grew up with the utter horror of what the Nazis did in my country breathing down my neck, and it's why American patriotism makes me so uncomfortable. Germany isn't the only country with a less than glamorous history. It just feels like we're the only ones who acknowledge it. Dunno if this counts, but I'll tell it. My family members are Russia Germans, so Germans that lived in Russia already for generations at that time. They most likely weren't affected by the German propaganda, but they were Germans in Russia, which probably wasn't really good either. They had to move all the way to Siberia, leaving their cows etc behind. My grandparents got separated from their parents. For my grandma there was a reunion. TBH, I don't know if they were ever separated, but I feel like I remember my great grandmother talking about this, but that was when I was a kid and she was pretty old, but no such thing for my grandpa. From what my mom told me, she had to work in the Gulag, I think due to being Russia German, and was worried sick about her kids. Apparently quite literally, because according to a friend of hers who was in the same spot, she died from that sorrow. As a consequence of all this, my grandpa didn't even know his actual birthday for some time. I think he was allowed to estimate it and made his birthday coincide with an important day, but don't ask me which one. As a side note that occurred to me while doing minor research for English terminology, I think the war affected Russia Germans even after the end. My mom and her siblings learned to speak German from their parents, but eventually they forgot and had to relearn pretty much everything. Then they immigrated to Germany. Even now they prefer to speak Russian to each other. Also, my mom and her brothers were apparently the first generation of the family reproducing with / marrying non-Russia Germans. Could have been because they didn't want to stick out as the Germans in Russia, or could be me interpreting too much into it. Edit. Grammar and stuff. My great-granddad was a Nazi soldier who guarded parts of Auschwitz. I was 16 when he died, and only saw him a few times, but when I did I would always ask about World War II. One thing he said really made me quiver. He said, I was at the front with the Gates and 2 other men beside me when a train pulls up, and a 15-year-old boy gets off and immediately just asks me to shoot him. We knew that we weren't allowed to kill them unless they did something wrong. And at this point I realized that Jews were human beings too, and started to ask myself what was wrong with them, but I could never quit or say things like this, or I would be killed, so I just minded my own business for the next year until the war ended. Another thing he said was there was a soldier who guarded with me, big guy 6'3", no one really liked him. He was okay for the day, but during the night he got bad. He used to go into the camps and just shoot at random people if he was angry. No one said anything because he was a very well-liked soldier. He once shot and killed a 7-year-old. This makes me angry as it would any person, but especially because I myself am Jewish because of my mum. Thank you for watching and enjoying this big bowl of Reddit soup. Feel free to leave a like and subscribe for more content like this.